Samantha, thank you so much for joining us here at IMpower. It's really great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So it's been an incredibly challenging period for the industry, so much change. What are you seeing at the moment in terms of what the greatest challenges in the immediate future are for you?
So the immediate future, it would be amiss not to talk about the markets. I mean, clearly the markets have in the last couple of months really been really volatile, and we definitely expect the volatility to continue. So I would say that, I mean, clearly in the shorter term markets are a challenge. When I look at, I would say, immediate and medium term sustainability, which is I know very much of what we've been hearing here and what we'll continue to hear, I'm sure, for the next day and a half, is sustainability and how we get asset management and just the industry to be at the level that everyone needs to be in terms of ESG is clearly for me a really important one, as well as digital. But I think that digital has just kind of become that word where everyone says digital. And I think it means so many things for different companies and different people. But I think figuring out what digital means to your firm and to your clients is going to be another important challenge together with ESG.
Seeing as you've mentioned it there has been a tendency to think of digital as just a sort of overlay on what already exists, and actually you need to take a more fundamental approach to how is that business model changing altogether perhaps. Is that something you're seeing in terms of retail investors adopting those changes or not?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that I wanted to go through a couple of our numbers at Santander as the group and not as the asset manager. And we have as Santander 144 million clients, of which 44 go through digital. So I think that really shows the tendency of digital. And it was only 36 million last year. So the growth there is very fast. However, what I would say is you're seeing the use of digital as an extra tool of getting to clients, but not the only one. Because I think there was a tendency in the firm of just saying, let's create tons of robo-advisors, for example. But what we are seeing is that people do want the facility and the flexibility to access digital, but often when it comes to investment advice, they want the digital to come with a personalized service of talking to someone.
It's interesting that this business has always prized itself in those relationships and that trust part and piece being such a huge part of why businesses are successful. And you think even with a younger demographic or a changing demographic of customer, that's still the case?
Yes, I still think there's a case. I mean, clearly, I think it depends on the markets and probably the demographics, where you might have places where people are much more comfortable with accessing digital advice. Brazil is a great example of that. I mean, the growth you've seen in Brazil, for example, of companies like XP and so on that are all about digital access and advice. But then you turn around and look at countries like Spain, for example, where digital is more the tool, but they really like to have the advice behind it of a person.
You mentioned ESG. It'd be remiss for me not to touch on it because it is such a big topic at every event and every conference that you might attend now. What do you see in that space, and how do you feel about the adoption of ESG across the board in companies? It has now become a necessity rather than a nicety, hasn't it, to have those policies in place?
Absolutely. I definitely believe that ESG should be at the core of what we do in this industry, but I still think that there's a tremendous amount of divergence between companies and, again, locations. So if I go into locations, and having been in Latin America for many years and now being in Europe, I can definitely say that in LATAM, it's still really early days in terms of ESG. It's seen still more as nice to have than a necessity. When I turn around and look at our businesses here, and I was in Germany last week, there is no way you're going to be able to talk to a client if what you offer them is not ESG. And I think that, for example, Latin America still has a way to go. So I guess the conclusion is ESG is definitely here to stay. It is a necessity, but I think that different parts of the world are navigating towards it at different paces.
It's really interesting hearing your global perspective there about different geographies, and presumably that's one of the big challenges for people running businesses, is to have that knowledge across the board if they are a global company, but to be really clever about the expertise they have in those geographies too. Is that something you're seeing more and more?
Yes, absolutely. And that's why I want to believe that as Santander Asset Management, we can be at the forefront of ESG in LATAM, for example, where there's still room to grow. And I think that's where you learn from what you're seeing in certain geographies and hopefully are able to apply the best practices in other geographies.
So ESG, one of the challenges. What else would you say are the greatest ones you face now in this business going forward?
So we talked about digital, we talked about ESG. I believe, even though it might not be the most sexy topic that everyone might be talking about, but I think is something we all need to focus on, is retirement. We all talk about what the younger generations want and need, and if they have digital tools and so on, but there's a huge population of older people that are going to be facing retirement. And I think that it is very clear, again, in different geographies at different times, but the governments are not going to be able to face up to giving people what they need to be able to live through retirement. And we're all living longer. So the problem exacerbates. And I think that we need to spend much more time on dealing with how do we help people achieve retirement respectfully, if you will. And then also, how do we help the younger generations save earlier? Because the biggest and most important lever to having a decent retirement is to start saving early. So I think that we all need to focus, yes, on ESG, yes, on digital, but retirement needs to be at the core of the conversation.
And interestingly, as a woman in this leadership role you're in, the statistics show that women are far poorer at retirement than men as well.
That is very true. And we live longer also statistically. So definitely that's an area where we want to be focusing on when we think of what segments do we want to focus on with a special angle is clearly, I think, women that are facing these changes and retirement and live longer, and they need to make sure that they're going to be able to get there.
Just finally, what do you hope to see in terms of transformation over the next few years as a leader in one of these businesses? What will you look back and say, yeah, I'm glad we got there, we did that? What will be the key thing for you, do you think?
Well, since we did speak about sustainability, which I really have very close to my heart, I think the other thing that I have personally very close to my heart is diversity. Coming from a Latin American background, Italian father, so more of the type of cultures where women don't necessarily spend that much time at work and they have to choose between work or family. I really hope that we see in the next generations that there are more women in these leadership roles, and that women know that if they want, they can have both things. They don't have to choose between a career and a family.
Because again, it shows in the bottom line that diversity is really profitable as well, because you have so much more diverse thinking.
Absolutely. So I think that people are starting to see finally those numbers and believe that diversity shouldn't just be a nice to have, but it really brings a more profitable business.
Well, I'm certainly very happy to see you here in the role you're in. Samantha, thank you so much for talking to us. Great to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.